So, Matthew Dowd, thank you for your time this morning.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
There are some people across Texas who may not know who Matthew Dowd is. So, in a few sentences, tell us who you are.
I've lived in Texas for almost 38 years. I've lived in the central Texas area. I live in Wimberley, which is outside of Texas. I've worked in politics on both sides of the aisle. I actually elected the last Democratic lieutenant governor and governor that the state had. I worked for George W. Bush, had a break with George W. Bush, and I've worked in media the last 13 years. So that's the postage stamp version of Matthew Dowd.
You just alluded to this. You were a Democrat in the 90s, a Republican in the early 2000s. You're running now as a Democrat again. There may be some Democrats out there who are skeptical of who you are. So explain how you can make this switch.
So it's all about my values, and in the 90s when I worked for Bullock and Ann Richards, which I call myself a Ann Richards, Bob Bullock Democrat, is who I am. I got to know then Governor Bush and watched how he worked across the aisle with a Democratic lieutenant governor, a Democratic speaker. I thought we could do the same thing when he asked me to work for him for president, which is the first time I had worked for a Republican. We could do the same thing in a very dysfunctional Washington. It didn't turn out that way. I had a very public break with President Bush over the war and the fact that the country was more divided. Became an independent at that point, was out of the politics in that way, in partisanship way. But I think over the aftermath of the last 5 years, but especially January 6th and the insurrection at the Capitol, and then what the Texas GOP legislature and statewide officials have done, I've come to the conclusion that the only vehicle that exists today with the two main political parties to sort of save democracy and reinvigorate the Constitution is through the Democratic Party right now. I don't think that exists today in the Republican Party. I think we benefit by having two vibrant, enlightened political parties. That doesn't exist today. So in my view, the only path to the promised land of having a state that pays attention to the Constitution and the rights of everyone and works in the common good is the Democratic Party, and that's why I'm running.
Let's talk policy. If you had to pinpoint the two biggest problems facing the state of Texas, what are they and how do you solve them?
So I think the biggest overall problem is a lack of leadership and a lack of Texas values that are shared by our statewide leaders. They're not people of integrity. They don't serve the public. They're not interested in the common good. And I don't think they treat everybody with the same dignity and decency. So it's an overall lack of complete leadership on behalf of most Texans here. They only appeal to a tiny group of people that happen to vote in a Republican primary, and that's all they're interested in. And I think most Texans are ill-served by the leadership. All of that manifests itself in many different issues. It manifests itself in a lack of fixing the electric grid, which all of us suffered through. I lost power and water for 8 days where I was from. They didn't fix the electric grid because it didn't seem like they were interested in what all Texans were going through. And then they've made an assault on rights, voting rights, a woman's right to decide over her own body, and guns, and how they've approached guns in this state. So to me, it's a complete lack of Texas values in Austin among the GOP. And it shows itself in how they've confronted all these issues, which they've seemed to have gone against the entire best interest of Texans as a whole.
So if lack of leadership is problem number one, what would you say is problem number two?
The inability to appeal to all Texans and not just a select group in the state. And so instead of only having the same people at the table, which is not diverse, both opinion and the way they look, whether it's women, people of color, they only have a select group that all believes the same exact thing, which again, I don't think is in the interest of all Texans. So I think it's leadership, and then I think they have no interest in the common good.
In just over a week in Texas, we've had two school shootings. There was one in Houston, one in North Texas in Mansfield. How do you keep people safe from gun violence, not just school children, but all Texans, while still respecting the Second Amendment?
So this to me is a huge issue because it goes to exactly what I'm talking about leadership and doing what's in the best interest of the common good. We've had more mass shootings in the last 10 years than we've ever had in this state. Schools and Walmarts and churches and all the places that it's happened. We're at the highest point of that. We had 3,500 people last year killed by gun violence, died by gun violence in this state. And what was the Republican leadership? And the man I'm running against, Dan Patrick's response to that was make it easier for people to carry guns without a permit or a license, the permitless carry bill, instead of some common sense gun reform. I'm a gun owner. I own 5 guns. I have 3 shotguns and 2 rifles. So I believe in the Second Amendment. But I also believe there are basic things you can do in response to this that shows we're a state that cares about life, that cares about the safety of kids and teachers and anybody that happens to be in any public gathering. Making guns more accessible and making them without training and making them without a permit is only going to make our state more violent and more dangerous to people. And so I have 3 things that I would want to do. First is red flag laws. It's insane that we don't have red flag laws, which means if somebody has a gun and they're either mentally unstable or a danger to themselves or others, that somebody can report that to a judge, and a judge can make a decision to temporarily remove the gun from the household to protect people. We need universal background checks with no loopholes, that everybody should have to go through a process, whether you buy a gun at a regular gun store or at a flea market or at a pawn shop or wherever. There ought to be universal gun laws in this state. And the third thing is we should roll back this permitless carry thing. Most Republicans, if you gave them truth serum, think it's outrageous that we've done this anyway. Democrats think it's outrageous. Independents think it's outrageous. And the majority of Texans, the vast majority of Texans, by 80%, support those three things. So to me, if we're going to do something and try to stop the rise of gun violence, we at least ought to try some things, and those 3 things I think are basic, to show and demonstrate that we're interested in the safety of people as they gather.
You alluded to abortion rights earlier. What, in your opinion, should abortion rights look like for a woman in Texas?
So I think that a right of a woman to decide and to choose her autonomy over their own body is fundamental to our Constitution. The Supreme Court has said that, and it's been that way for 50 years. What the Republicans did was basically roll back Roe versus Wade. They're not allowing it. They basically rolled it back, including women that are raped or a victim of incest. And so we ought to go back to the parameters of Roe versus Wade. I think what they did is unconstitutional, and a court has already begun to weigh in on that process. A woman ought to have that right. A fundamental right to a woman is the right of her own decisions over her own body, and I don't think it's appropriate for a state legislator or a state senator or the lieutenant governor to be in the room, which is basically what that is, when they make that decision. A terrible choice, a tough choice, a very hard choice, a moral choice that women make, that she has to weigh many different things, including conversations she has with her minister or priest in that. That's where it ought to stay and not be in the middle of a government overreach and taking away that freedom from a woman.
So you have worked for politicians in the past. Mm-hmm. Why is now the right time to become the politician yourself?
So if you had asked me on New Year's Day this year if I was going to run, I would have laughed and said, what are you talking about? There's no way I'm going to do that. My life was good. I live in Wimberley on the Blanco River. I write a lot. I have a book coming out in a month or so that it's more of a spiritual book, meaning a life book. I had a good life, got 4 kids who are great. But as I watched everything unfold, I kept asking myself, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do more after January 6th and the legislative session and what the lieutenant governor did here? And so I finally came to the conclusion late this summer that, one thing I could do is run for office as a Democrat and tell the truth for 400 days. Tell the truth about what's going on. Tell the truth about when the power that exists in the lieutenant governor's office is great. I work for a man that used it for good, and I'm watching a man who uses it that's a detriment to our state. I love this state. I love Texas, but I hate our politics. I absolutely hate our politics. And in my view, I was willing to sort of sacrifice all those things in the life I had in order to tell Texans what's going on and how we can get out of this.
Why run for lieutenant governor? Why not say, I want to be governor?
So to me, one, I worked for 8 years and I know what the lieutenant governor office is, and I worked for the last Democratic lieutenant governor, and so I know the power in that office. I know how it operates. I think I'm a consensus builder, and I know how to get people to collaborate, which you need to be able to do as governor. Bring people together. You're going to have to bring Republicans together, and you're going to have to bring Democrats together. I know how to do that. I've lived a life. My life path has been a life path of that in my transitions in my life. And so for me, it's an office that both is personal to me because I've been very acquainted to it, and I also know the power it has. And while the governor has many different powers, the lieutenant governor is incredibly powerful in where the state goes. And we've watched that happen in this state, where Dan Patrick and his agenda, which I view as very extreme and not in the interest of Texans, has pushed the governor in a further way than I think that even the governor would want to go. And so the power of the office and the fact that I personally am aware of how it can be used.
Mike Collier ran in 2018, came relatively close. He has structure in place. So where do you see your path to victory? If he came close, didn't quite get it done, and he's building on that, what's your path to victory?
So I'm going to spend the next, I think it's now 395 days until Election Day in November, telling the truth and running against Dan Patrick. I'm not going to run against Mike Collier or anybody else that might happen to file. To me, this race isn't about Mike Collier or another Democrat. It's about what the Republicans have done in the legislature. And I'm going to go on the trail, which I've already been. Came from San Antonio the other day, was in Waco, in Dallas-Fort Worth, going to go to East Texas, West Texas, the border, South Texas. And I'm just going to show Texans and Texas Democrats what my values are. And it's going to be up to them to make that decision, that who's the best candidate to go against Dan Patrick and who can win. I think I've demonstrated in my history I have ability to win races. And voters are just going to have to ask themselves and decide who they want, who shares their values, but who can win in November.
You said you're not going to run against Mike Collier. Mike Collier is running against you. Yesterday, when I spoke with him, he said he called you mostly a Republican. How do you respond to that?
So, I mean, it's a one. I'm not going to run against Mike Collier in this race at all. But I would just Mike Collier should look at his own history. I left the Republican Party way before Mike Collier ever left the Republican Party. He's a much more newer person to this process than I am to this process. I elected the last Democratic lieutenant governor and the last Democratic governor. The last time Texas Democrats held power in this state, I was intimately involved in it and won. And so he's going to just have to ask himself, is it in his best interest, in the interest of Texas Democrats, to run against me, or is it our goal to beat Dan Patrick? My goal is to beat Dan Patrick. I said from the beginning I'm not going to run a negative campaign or attack Mike Collier. I'm going to stick to that for every day. I'm not going to spend $1 running against Mike Collier or attacking Mike Collier. To me, this race is about Dan Patrick.
It's going to take money to beat Dan Patrick. To run in any statewide campaign is expensive in Texas. Talk to me about fundraising and about how you're going to make this happen.
So all of the fundraising is going to come from small dollar donations in this state. I'm not taking any corporate PACs. I'm not going to take any money from corporate PACs. The great thing I think about me and my platform and what I've done before is it allows us as Democrats to raise money from other states that hasn't been available before. We've not held a single fundraiser yet. I have not made a single fundraising phone call, and we have almost 5,000 contributors to the campaign, half of which are from out of state, half of which are people who don't like what's happening in Texas and want to help us in Texas. And so that's the only way we're going to raise the money that we need. We're not going to have as much money as Dan Patrick. He has millions of dollars of special interest money that is going to support him. We'll have enough from people who care. And if we show we can win, then I think the money will be there that we need.
We don't know who's running for governor on the Democratic side of things. Who would you like to see?
Well, Beto's a friend of mine. I've known Beto a long time. I've known Beto since he was on the city council. He's going to make a decision that whether or not he's going to get in the race. I hope he does, because I think he has a voice in this process that I think would be very strong and very beneficial for the whole ticket. So that's another race the Democratic Party will sort out. But I'm a friend of his. I think he's done great work on a lot of different things on voting rights. He did great work during the electric grid failure in bringing people together to help solve the problem. So I hope he gets in, and I look forward, if I'm the nominee and he's the nominee, of running together.
Say that Matthew Dowd is the lieutenant governor. What do you do on your first day in office?
The first thing I do is basically bring all the senators in and say, this is how I want to operate. And I'm willing to work with anybody here, as long as you do three things. Leave partisanship at the door, that we're going to do what's in the best interest and not what's interested in our party, no matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. That you're going to work on behalf of all Texans, that you're going to do this. The policy is not for a particular special interest, that we're going to create policies that are for everybody, and that we're going to base policies on science and facts. And if it's based on science and facts, you leave your partisanship at the door, and we're working on interest in all Texans, everybody, we're going to get along great, and the table is going to be wonderful, and we're going to have great policy. If you're not, then you may have a problem with me.
Thank you for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
It's great to be here.